We're very fortunate to have Professor Pratap Bhanu Mehta with us. He is, of course, a contributing editor for the Indian Express, apart from being, let's say, the moral voice, one of the great moral voices in our media landscape in country today. We'll be discussing the US election, which is, I think, voting has been going on for some time at least, mail-in ballots and such. And the actual thing is on the 5th of November. We will might know the results by the 6th, depending on how close a contest and how contested the contest it ends up being afterwards. So the first question, in India, I mean, because we're so used to this sort of first past the post multi-party democracy,
Yeah, yeah,
that's been the common understanding for a lot of us used to be that in the States, the two-party system will sort of push everyone to the middle. That you'll have this primary
yeah,
system, and there'll be, but these two broad umbrella parties, the Republicans and Democrats,
right,
center left, center right, is what you'll broadly end up with. That was at least the
right.
post-Clinton sort of consensus in recent years. That seems to have changed a bit with Trump, of course, but some would say even among Democrats, even among the left, that there's a sort of what they
Right.
were the Americans say, the fringe becoming the what you have to cater to, the base becoming more important than the middle. How do you see that as a development and what that does to a political system?
Thank you, Akash. Always fun to talk to you. Um, I think one has to look at this question in a slightly longer term historical perspective. So, this argument that a two-party system, in a sense, pushes everybody to a kind of centrist moderation, right? And the argument was because you're trying to aim at the median voter. In a sense, the two parties will have their agendas will have to converge in some ways, right? And therefore, you will get this kind of immense kind of political stability and consensus around a kind of center right versus center left story. Um, when we look at that argument, I think, and some of that argument is true, and I would argue that some of it still holds in one very important respect, because historically that argument was made in the context of the contest between kind of socialism and capitalism, right? Or very left of center economics versus very right of center economics, right? And what's interesting about even this election, there are significant differences between the two parties. But in historical terms, the economic policy frameworks of the two parties are actually
Yeah.
not very radically different, right? I mean, the Biden administration took on Trump's first term agenda of imposing tariffs and rolling back globalization. Trump is not going to touch Medicare and Medicaid, right? There's always been this debate over cutting taxes for the rich, but again, in a sense, within certain margins. So actually, the context in which the argument was formulated, right, which was largely, in a sense, about the broad economic policy, the difference still isn't stark. I mean, yes, Trump might call Kamala Harris a communist, right? Or Kamala Harris might call, Elon Musk a loony right-wing libertarian or something like that. Actually, framework isn't, I mean, that broad kind of side center, slightly left of center and slightly right of center economic policy bandwidth still holds. Where we are seeing the polarization is one on social issues, right? So issues like reproductive rights, gender transition, the ethnic makeup of America, and immigration, right? And in fact, there is a theory out there that actually says that one of the reasons you get more polarization on social issues is precisely because the consensus on economic issues is actually greater. I mean, how do you distinguish yourself, right? If in a sense, people don't, the differences in those articulations don't look that big to people. It's just a question of economic performance, who has kept inflation under check, what are the gas prices yesterday, right? So, one, there is a kind of dialectical relationship that ironically, actually, economic consensus can actually produce greater emphasis on social polarization. The second thing that I think this is significant about this election is, in a sense, the social basis of the two parties, right? So, in a way, the classic, again, left of center, right of center polarization was around the conflict between labor and capital, right?
Yeah.
that you will need a framework that reconciles the interests of labor and capital and pushes them both to the middle, right, in some ways. Now, the big class divide is not labor versus capital. I mean, that might factually be a divide, but in terms of political articulation and consciousness, the big class divide is between those who are educated and those who have college degrees and those who don't. And that divide is a economic divide in part. Returns to college going education are quite high. But that divide is also a big cultural divide, right? Because college degree going students, part of the population, are associated with certain kinds of identity concerns, right? And in some senses, the social base of the Democratic Party, which used to be the working class, has now become, in a sense, the educated, degree holding university class. And ironically, the Republicans have made more inroads into the working class, right? So, in that sense, I think the class context where college going educated becomes a kind of class in its own right, not just an economic interest, but almost acquiring the attributes of a kind of identity interest, also begin to take center stage.
So that was going to be my second question. So I'll just follow up on what you just said. So, is this I mean, there might be lessons for, say, center-left parties around the world from this, that what happens when you cannot, you're no, you're caught up in, I mean, whether caught up or whether responding to, say, identity concerns, gender transition, which the Republicans seem to be blowing out of proportion. It's almost one of their bogies as much as immigration. They'll come for your kids and give them, puberty blockers. This is, JD Vance just said it in Joe Rogan, I think, 10 times. I heard a 3 hour interview. Is there something, and even the other thing is that you're also seeing, say, the racial divide sort of shifting. That the latest polls seem to be showing that black men, again, who probably a lot of them don't fit into that college going category, as well as Hispanic men, Latino men, are not a majority, at least by the opinion polls, but certainly a significant number seem to be shifting to Trump. What do you make of that? Is it just garden variety misogyny, which a recent interview someone said to us, or is there more to it than that?
I mean, but let's try and put the best case construction on the argument.
Yeah,
Often politics is about surface and
yeah,
symbolism and rhetoric, right?
yeah.
I think fundamentally what this election is bringing out, right, is that, I mean, irrespective of the theatrics and the aesthetics of politics, which is extremely ugly in this election, there are actually some deep fundamental issues bubbling up that I think voters are struggling to see who can actually address them best, right? So the first, obviously, is in the American context, immigration, right? Now, the issue with immigration is America is a nation of immigrants, and there is still a broad consensus that there should be pretty high volumes of legal immigration into America, right? The debate is over how do you think of illegal immigration and how do you think of the terms on which those whom you allow to immigrate actually assimilate into American society. This is a kind of big 20th century American debate. Now, what has happened, I think, is that the Democrats lost the high moral ground on immigration. Partly because this message seemed to go out that they're all pro-immigration, but they don't actually want to create the governance structures that can actually, in some senses, help orderly immigration. Not just to the border, but this kind of spectacle of busing people to New York, one third of New York hotels kind of taken over by immigrants, the crisis of homelessness in democratic cities like New York and San Francisco, right? Um, I think on immigration, I think the issue is really which party effectively handles it better. And again, the frameworks are not that different if you dig deep. I mean, there's this tough macho thing Trump wants to project. The Democrats veer between kind of compassion and toughness, but the actual border policies aren't that different, right? So that's I think one. The second thing, I think this issue of sort of wokeism and you know gender identity. Now, you're absolutely right that at one level you might say, I mean, how many people does this whole discourse of kind of gender transition actually affect? right? I mean, this is the Republicans not just making a mountain out of a molehill, even if there was something, I mean, what's the issue here, right? And certainly when you contrast it with, right, the issue of abortion, which actually affects a lot more people, right? But I think what is at stake is actually not the numbers on this issue. What is at stake is the sense that a lot of people have, or a lot of Republican supporters have, is that the most fundamental norms of society are actually beginning to shift, right? Um, they are saying, look, we are tolerant, we think people should have various kinds of freedoms, but the norm that something like gender is entirely a matter of self identification, right? That norm is a very, very radical shift, right? That, I mean, the flippant version is like Germany allows you to do, you can change your gender 3 times a year or something on official records, right? Um, the Democrats have sometimes overplayed the hand. I mean, in states like New Hampshire, it's extraordinary, right? In America, you have to be 21 to drink in some states. You have to be 18 to vote. You need parental permission for a whole range of things. Actually, in some states, one thing you don't need parental permission for is actually gender transitioning thing. So I think it's really about a contest over how we articulate the norm, and both sides are actually tapping into something that to them seems objectively good. On the one hand, there's this romantic vision, right, that our identities can be entirely self-defining all the way down, including gender, right? Not only is not a social construct, I mean, it's just something we can actually, in some senses, construct, right? On the other hand, there is this view that, look, yes, we want people to have all the freedoms they do, but surely there must be some facts of the matter, right, around gender identity. So I actually think, I mean, if you kind of cut through the kind of rhetoric, there is actually a collision of two deep principles of modernity here, which
Yeah.
objectivity in one
Yeah.
sense and kind of the self-defining freedom on the other, which are in a sense, I think, colliding. Uh, other interesting thing about identity politics, as you mentioned, right, which is one of the mistakes the left has always made is a certain kind of demographic determinism, right? If you're black, you will vote a certain way. If you're Latino, you will vote a certain way. India has also versions of this argument, right?
Yes.
But these constituencies they're constructed. They are a lot more strategic. Internally, they're a lot more divided. The class interests of professional blacks and working class blacks, maybe in a sense, diverging. Very recent Latino, immigrants from Latin American countries actually have a stronger political tradition of conservatism, right? And I think one of the things people revolt against is this idea that they're being denied agency simply because you're just assuming that their identity is going to just tell you, right, which way or the other they will vote. One remarkable thing about this election, which people haven't actually remarked on enough, right? Um, when we used to think of race issues, right, we used to think affirmative action was the kind of holy grail of American politics, right? That's something Democrats stood for. That's something Republicans broadly sought to roll back and have effectively managed to roll back, right? The Supreme Court decision on affirmative action in American universities, the rolling back of these kind of diversity initiatives, right? But what's interesting is it's the first election in some senses. I mean, there's a lot of Republican talk about EI, this diversity
Yeah.
inclusion institutions.
Right.
But actually, the Democrats are not out there defending affirmative action deeply. Now, partly you could say that, look, it's a strategic choice by Kamala Harris. She doesn't want to foreground the race issues. I mean, in some senses, she's taken a conscious decision to keep the conversation off that. But it is actually interesting how what used to be the most important issue in American politics, right? I mean, every convention used to really be about affirmative action one way or the other. That's the kind of the the silent thing in the background that nobody's
Yeah.
talking
No.
about.
So just the final one on the message, then I'll take us a little bit America and outside America. Just again, taking off from what you said, for the Democrats, and even say, the liberal media, which we make so much, the sort of left liberal or left broadly American political camp, to lose working people, to not articulate. I mean, and even to say, be identified with the system, with it. So, it starts with, say, Bernie Sanders being sort of in the party primaries. Through technicalities, you exclude him because he's a little too socialist. I mean, it might be more complex than that, but that was when Hillary's during that primary. Then subsequently now with the dichotomy between how you treat Israel and how you treat the Ukraine war, in terms of backing and innocence and invasion. I mean,
Yeah.
do you think even for just bringing people out, right, in their own camp, at a certain point, this the compulsions of statecraft perhaps get associated with your politics, and then it's very difficult to take a left stand, so to speak, when all of this you've done.
Let me give kind of two kinds of answers. At one level, I agree with you. I mean, I think, the compulsions of statecraft, the compulsions of immediate electoral victories almost always kind of pushes you in a slightly conservative direction, right? Because you have to kind of take people's preferences as they are, right? In some ways. I actually think there is a much more complicated problem, which is that under current regimes, economic regimes of development and capitalism, it is proving harder to create narratives, right? Or create economic frameworks, which can actually, in a sense, reconcile the interests of these diverging classes, right? In some ways. And so the question then becomes, who do you use? Now, the point about the working class, in a sense, is that demographically, the size of the manufacturing working class was shrinking, right? In some senses, I mean, that's one sort of straightforward explanation, right? For the kind of loss of relative power. Whereas, in a sense, when you have half the country with college degrees and those kinds of identities, obviously, you can't completely kind of, in a sense, lose them either, right? Which is not to say that there aren't significantly more radical measures. You can actually, in a sense, talk to, in a sense, the working class, right? But I think across the world, I mean, in some senses, there is like a single democracy you can think of where any political party has actually managed to reconcile a slightly more kind of left to center vision that incorporates the working class and yet kind of craft out the electoral majority, right? Just because the nature of class politics and the nature of a kind of capitalist system now actually, makes this much more complicated.
Finally, I want to take again on this wokeism stuff. And also, Trump was sort of in 16 when he'd come, and it was, there was all this talk of this global right-wing shift from Europe. India was considered part of that to an extent after the election of Prime Minister Modi. What is the connection in terms of both ideas and politics between, say, a Trump victory and his loudness? Because, see, for the first time in his 100-year speech, the Vijayadashmi speech, we hear Mohan Bhagwat using woke and wokeism as threats to unity. These vocabularies that are traveling now. I just wanted to get your sense on that, because we were just talking about
No,
that.
no, so look, I mean, and it is interconnected, right? I mean,
Yeah.
Orban,
Yeah.
advisors and Trump's
Yeah.
advisors talk to each other.
Yeah.
There's a kind of circulating, realm
Yeah.
of ideas. The RSS went to the National Conservative Convention in Washington, D.C. in, July or something, right?
Yeah.
Uh, So again, I think there are two levels, right? So one is the kind of the rhetorical use of the term wokeism, right?
Yeah.
And in sense to conjure up this completely or this kind of apocalyptic scenario in some senses, right? Of this kind of fundamental change in our norms, right? But I think at its core, if you say, okay, what's the appeal? Because as you rightly said, I mean, how many people does this really affect? I mean, a bunch of colleges doing some crazy things at the margin, seriously, right? I mean, you know, why get as much worked up around this, even if you have issues about this? I think fundamentally, right, what Trump represents and what Modi represented, and what the RSS is now trying to position itself is, what Orban position itself is, the way they position themselves is to say that, look, there was an old order that was an elitist order, right? it was an elitist order in the Indian case because, there's a kind of inherited ancient regime, dynastic politics, very familiar faces, familiar ideologies that kind of dominates, right? It's an elitist order because, in some senses, it was out of touch with the vocabularies and the aspirations and the idioms in which ordinary people express themselves, and had a kind of certain kind of contempt for mass religiosity and mass nationalism, right? That's broadly the right. And moreover, right, it justified this elitism in the name of saying, look, we are the vanguard that are going to propel you into some higher plane of moral values, right? We are going to actually teach you what real secularism is, you know, what a modern country looks like. These elites position themselves as this kind of vanguard of kind of moral transition. Now, at the current moment, what's interesting about wokeism is that wokeism stands in as a figure of exactly that kind of moral elitism, right? So, these are kind of college educated, I mean,
Yeah.
the one thing Modi and Trump share is they don't like the Ivy Leagues, right?
Yeah.
Hard work, not Harvard. I mean, they
Yeah.
completely, right? Test Harvard,
Yeah.
right? And it works as a symbol because those are signs of elitism. And frankly, the nature, the lack of class mobility, and the nature of what has happened to our social structures, these elite institutions, they appear more like castes to the outside population in some senses, right? And wokeism then becomes just another example of that kind of elitism. I don't think they're intrinsically interested. In fact, many of them privately are quite, just like they've
Yeah.
made their
Absolutely.
accommodations with gay
Yeah.
marriage and gay rights, they're
Yeah.
actually quite open, right? But as a kind of potent symbol of this is the elite that's not going to rest content with what your morality is. It's going to come in and tell you, what a forward-looking morality looks like.
Right. No, so
So
again,
it's a
this
stand-in
this
for elitism in a way.
but there is an interesting thing that say Trump has managed to do particularly, and some would argue that in other places as well, that he is a recorded liar, as the Democrats and the say the media in America, the non-Fox News sort of the liberal media in America, constantly is fact, and there is enough. But I mean, an academic friend of mine said this. In fact, I thought I'd put it to you, is that he somehow has managed to say I am authentic, while to be this claim to authenticity. And he's a billionaire. It is an inherited, I mean, he starts out with inherited wealth. He's a billionaire. I mean, he is, if there is a,
Yeah.
do you think that is also just a failure of the left to find that vocabulary, that elite left, whether in America or in India, to find a vocabulary that is more authentic to connect with people who are not college educated?
So I think the problem is somewhat different. I mean, I think again we can stress too much on the vocabulary and idioms. I mean,
Right.
look,
Yeah,
the same people who are successful in politics 10, 15, 20 years ago, the
exactly.
Clintons and
And
the
they might
Obamas
be
did
again.
win, right?
Yeah.
The Jawaharlal Nehrus did win, right? I think the problem is actually deeper for, let's say, the non-Trump is the left, right? So when we say Trump is a liar, right, you have to think of the historical backdrop of the claim. The historical backdrop of the claim is there is a widespread skepticism that the main liberal left truth producing institutions actually produce truth, right? That's the mega claim, right? So, okay, you can say Trump is a liar, but I mean, how do you defend the New York Times or the Economist lying about pretty much every war that has happened in the 20th century, right? I mean, you know, it's the left and the liberals that have
Exactly.
insulated themselves, right, from that criticism. So actually, what these people are doing is, in a sense, occupying that larger crisis of trust in truth-producing institutions, right? That we just can't trust the media, MSM, mainstream media. When have they last produced the truth? We can't trust, universities. They've become too partisan or given over to kind of particular agendas. So it's against that backdrop, right, that actually his lies, at least in personal and individual, right,
Yeah.
as opposed to what people think of as the kind of systemic structural lie in some senses that dominant elite institutions had, in a sense, produced, in some ways, right? Even COVID, I mean, it's interesting, right? I mean, how much that has come up in this case, which is, look, liberal institutions will not let you honestly talk about where the virus actually arose, or, um, Elon Musk's pitch for free speech. Now, Elon is no defender of free speech. He's quite happy with censorship in China, quite happy with censorship in Russia. But the fact that the free speech argument can be taken over by the
Yeah.
right, I think so. So I think the problem for the left and slip is actually the courage of their own convictions and their own credibility. That somehow people have lost trust in those processes and institutions that claim to represent, these liberal ideas.
So, now and there is a lot of anxiety among a certain section, perhaps. That first, this. I think Raja Mohan had just written, Professor Raja Mohan in his last column
Right.
or the one before that, that in India we don't get a vote. First of all, that doesn't it is affects us, but we don't get a vote. So, but if you one was to take that kind of sort of clinical distance, as he'd like, as a realist, is Trump really bad news for the world? I mean, keeping us apart, or is he as bad as he's made out to be by some people?
So look, the honest answer to that is, and this is, I think, part of Trump's appeal, is the variance in possible outcomes with Trump is very large, right? I can run a plausible scenario where, just from a global perspective, I mean, obviously what happens internally to America also affects the world, but if just we artificially make this distinction for a moment, right? We can run a scenario where he's actually quite disastrous. So he comes in, he not just raises tariffs, but he raises tariffs to inordinately high levels. In America, can get away with it. Right? It's a large country. It's energy self-sufficient. Most importantly, it really can actually almost kind of pull some of that stuff off if it tried, in a way in which most of the other countries can't. Right. So he just goes about beggaring everybody else, right? In terms of his vision of the global economic, right? It's a kind of disaster. On the other hand, you can actually imagine him sitting around a table negotiating decent reciprocal tariffs, so long as they are equal in some senses, right? May not be optimal for us, but actually not such a disaster, right? Um, on the war front, right, which is really the big elephant in the room in this election, and the Democrats are struggling. Look, uh, with two major wars going on, I mean, there's others as well, but two geostrategically consequential wars going on, and which are kind of taking the form of a global conflict. I mean, you have 100,000 North Korean troops now fighting in Ukraine. I mean, absolutely extraordinary, actually, with this idea that, this is just a kind of confined war, is not going to work. You have the absolute moral catastrophe in the Middle East, right? I think a lot of people looking at this and say, how much worse can it get, right? And that it's precisely in unpredictability might actually allow room for kind of negotiation. Now, in America, he's being portrayed as he's going to sell out to Putin, right?
Yeah.
But there is a kernel of truth in a reasonable articulation of that position that at some point there will have to be a
They sit
negotiated
down.
settlement
Yeah.
on Ukraine. I mean, as much as I personally believe Ukraine's claims are morally very compelling. I mean, the idea that Russia can just gobble up a country, a sovereign country, is unacceptable. But, right, you will have to negotiate, in a sense, a kind of exit ramp from that, right? Um, I think, I mean, is Israel Palestine, I mean, in a way, as for most of the 20th century, the Palestinians have got the worst end of the deal of pretty much every power that has been around, right? So I think some people look at this and say, will he be really that worse? On the other hand, he could be completely mercurial, right? He could, take immense risks with Iran, provoke them into nuclearization at a much greater level than we have seen. So I think the short answer is the range of possibilities is actually quite high with Trump. And I think he trades on that. I mean, I think part of his appeal is on that.
Yeah.
Look, I mean, all options are on the table here.
Yeah.
And that's how he negotiates.
Yeah, Sarizan. So one last question on, it would be remiss if we didn't cover it. The abortion issue, as you put it up, particularly, Kamala Harris came out very strongly on abortion. From the midterms, it seemed clear that that is where, and I think Trump and Vance have tried to, in fact, walk back some of them, or at least, and saying it's a states issue. Of course, we're not against abortion. We want women to have freedom. But is that resonant enough still as her popularity is going down, or is that sort of, is there a boredom with that issue? But it seems to have sort of petered out a little bit, though she's trying to keep a focus on it for people at the. Is it an undecided voter issue, do you think?
So I don't think it's an undecided voter issue. I mean, I think
Yeah,
this is one issue in which I think
the
people's views
likelihood
tend
of
to
it.
be very clear,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
I think really the issue is, and in a sense, she's relying on, in a sense, right, women voters, particularly white women voters who have, in a sense, claimed this struggle over kind of rights, for the last 30, 40 years, actually coming out in
yeah,
large numbers, right? So in that sense, I think, and clearly they are aiming at that demographic in some senses, and it's around that issue. I think the challenge is really, look, each party has some deal breakers, right? So for those who are undecided about the Democratic Party, are in part undecided because of the conduct of the war, right? I mean, in critical states, that's a kind of issue. And the question is, how many of them will ultimately hold their noses and turn up and vote for her? So, of the Democrats who are disillusioned with the Democratic Party, right? How many of them will prefer to stay at home or sit it out versus actually just hold their noses and say, yeah, look, this is terrible, but all things said and done, we still would rather fight under a Democratic administration than a Republican one. The same is true in a sense on the Trump side, right?
yeah,
Which is the number of never Trumper Republicans big enough that they say, look, I mean, uh, Trump has done enough deals for it to be a deal breaker, for a deal breaker. And certainly, at kind of higher levels of ex-Republicans, there's a number of them, some former generals, former senators, who've come out in favor of Kamala Harris, including not to Kamala Harris's advantage, people like Dick Cheney and so forth, right?
yeah,
But the question is, how many of them decide, right, that we are just sitting this one out?
yeah.
So I think the abortion thing is a kind of issue, but I think the question is whether it's overshadowed by, right,
Bye. Yeah.
these other vulnerabilities, particularly around war and immigration.
Right, sir. Thank you so much. We will have the results soon. We'll see what you have to say on that once it's done, of course, in the
Great.
Indian Express. Thank you so much, sir.